Good morning, 8th graders. Today is April 9th, 2020, day 19 of our quarantine. Still moving on, doing a great job. Check your grades, keep doing that. Today we're going to finish up the rest of chapter 18, the end results of Reconstruction. Just really quick fly through some of what happens in the early 1870s. And we've already talked about racism and types of Reconstruction and the results. And we're going to finish that up today. And then you have a quiz that will be set up to take in Schoology. It's a 13-question quiz. Pretty easy. Use resources that you need to use. Have that done today, please, on Thursday. I'd like it done. I don't like it when stragglers are waiting a week to take my quizzes, so get that done, please. So moving back into yesterday's information, we were talking about, let's see, where were we? We were up here talking about Grant fighting the Klan and the prevalence or predominance of the Klan, and most of you left some pretty good comments for me on the stream. I really appreciate that. That was a good job. So Panic of 1873. So we're 8 years after the war. The stock market plunges. Banks begin to close. There's an economic depression that lasts for 5 years. Depressions are usually associated with a drop in the value of stocks, which oftentimes causes banks to close, because when a bank ultimately takes your money, that money is invested either in the market, the stock market, which we'll talk about in another lesson on another day, or in loans to other people. Well, when people lose money or don't have a way to make money, they can't pay their debts, banks begin to close, which causes the market to plunge into further depression. Now, back in the old days, if the bank closed and you had money sitting in an account, you lost it. It didn't exist. So you had to have a lot of confidence and faith in the banks. Today, if you put money in a bank account, that money is protected by the FDIC in most banks, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So you feel pretty confident that your money is going to be there if there is an economic depression. So we've been, in this year, this is 2020, we've been riding really high for about 8 or 10 years. The stock market has been doing this. It goes down a little bit, goes up, and we're clear up here. And then recently we've dropped. Part of it, a lot of it has to do with the situation we're in with the COVID-19, and a lot of people are out of work right now. So we're not in an economic depression. An economic depression would be defined if this is a long-term thing, and we see large numbers of unemployed people, and we see the market continue to plunge, and we see large numbers of people that can't afford to take care of their basic necessities. We would call that an economic depression. But we first have to go through a recession, which requires 2 quarters of lack of growth in the economy. And we'll have one for sure. We'll see what happens in the duration of the COVID-19 pandemic that we're going through. But an economic depression, the worst in our history was in the 1930s, which we should be able to hopefully get to by the end of the year. We'll see. So we've had other economic depressions. Most of the time they last for a couple of years. A 5-year depression is really pretty long. When there's an economic depression, we oftentimes see the leadership that's in charge blamed for the depression. Well, up from all the way to 1860 up through 1873, the government was controlled by the Republican Party. So the Republicans get the blame for the depression. We vote for people that might pull us out of depression. We look for answers from somebody else. And Democrats are able to win victories. In the Compromise of 1877, we see a presidential election. Rutherford Hayes, that's this guy here with needs to trim his mustache and his facial hair, runs against a Democrat named Samuel Tilden. Look at this. He wins by... Tilden wins the popular vote, which has happened multiple times in our history, including in the last election when Mrs. Clinton, Senator Clinton, won the popular vote, but Donald Trump won the electoral vote. But this is an issue here. 185 electoral votes to 184 electoral votes. That's really close. So what happens is it actually was a tie, and in order to break the tie, they had to vote on it. And Hayes makes some promises behind the scenes. He promises to remove federal troops from the South to gain the Southern Democrats' vote. He promises land and loans to the South to rebuild. Hayes would appoint a Democrat to his cabinet, so a Republican with a Democrat in his cabinet. Not at all strange or unheard of. In fact, that's relatively common. I don't believe it exists today, but it's pretty common for a president to have someone from another political party in their cabinet. And Democrats had to promise in return to respect African American rights. Will that really happen? Well, you should know the answer to that, as even today, still in 2020, we battle issues with prejudice and racism in parts of our country. So, respecting African American rights is still something that we're working on. So, what happens? Well, Reconstruction is a bit of a failure. We do reunite the Union, but there are such regional and sectional differences that you can't tell a huge difference between what America looked like before the war and what America looked like after Reconstruction. The South was still very heavily agricultural and relied on no longer a slave population of laborers, but sharecroppers and tenant farmers were not a whole lot better or had more rights than slaves did anyway. So that part of the Southern economy really didn't change a whole lot. And the North still looked pretty much the same either. African Americans did have a few more rights, although most of the legal rights and privileges given to African Americans were not extended for another 100 years. It won't be until the 1950s and 60s, even up through today, where we begin to really put a microscope on the rights of African Americans and look for creating equality. Slavery is outlawed. That does not exist anymore. And the federal government didn't enforce the new amendments. So, for instance, even though the 13th Amendment frees the slaves, the 14th Amendment gives them citizenship, and the 15th Amendment provides them with the right to vote. Some states found ways around the 15th Amendment, just as an example. So it does say you cannot take away a person's right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It doesn't, however, say anything about literacy. So, for instance, all the way up into the 1960s, some states, like I'll use Alabama as an example, were giving literacy tests to African Americans. In fact, literacy test, in order to make it constitutional, was given to everyone, except they had what was called a grandfather clause, which meant if your grandfather could vote, you didn't have to take the test, which meant all white men didn't have to take the test because their grandfathers could vote. Blacks, however, whose grandfathers were oftentimes slaves, could not vote until they took and passed a literacy test. That literacy test had nothing really to do with literacy. In fact, the 1964 Alabama voter registration test is supposed to be a literacy test, almost all with American history and civics, how the government functions. And if I were to give you all, who I assume are all fairly literate, the literacy test from Alabama, you would all fail. And you are definitely more literate than most African Americans, are definitely more well-schooled in politics and history than most African Americans would have been in 1964 Alabama because of lack of education and segregated schools. So they found ways around allowing those rights and privileges preferred to them in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And as a result, the black community continued to live in poverty, and still probably a significantly higher proportion of the black population, especially in the South, lives in higher poverty than the whites across the street from them. I don't have the statistics on that, but I think that probably bears true. And we also find out that people don't like to be forced to do something. Our government tries all the time to shove things down our throat, and usually that ends up backfiring on them. Americans are very independent-minded people, and we like to choose what we like to do. Stock market is where you buy and sell shares of companies. We'll talk more about that later. A depression is low business activity, high unemployment. Unemployment means people aren't working. High unemployment means large numbers of people aren't working. Compromise, each side has to give up something. We've talked about that before in the past. An amendment is an addition to the Constitution. None of that is new stuff. So I will get your Chapter 18 quiz posted into Schoology and ready to activate on Thursday morning at about 8 o'clock. Please get that taken care of, and you guys have a great weekend. Miss ya. Talk to you later.